You know, there is a very specific, acrid smell that happens when your entire life is reduced to wet ash and twisted metal. A scent that clings to the back of your throat like a bad memory you just can't swallow. And as I stand here in the charred remains of what used to be my kitchen, clutching a thermos of lukewarm coffee and looking at the scorched outline of where my daughter used to eat her cereal, I can't help but appreciate the dark, twisted irony of it all. See, the woman who ordered this, the woman who thought burning down my family home was the only way to get me to join her little suburban club, she made one fatal miscalculation, one massive oversight that is currently sending her to federal prison for a very long time. She didn't realize that I am the one who literally wrote the municipal fire codes she just violated. My name is Arthur Vance, and for the last 2.5 decades, I've been a municipal code enforcement officer in the town of Silver Creek, which basically means I'm the guy who shows up with a clipboard when you decide to build a deck without a permit or try to run an illegal auto repair shop in your driveway. A job that my teenage twins, Leo and Maya, always thought was the most boring profession on earth until the day it became the only weapon we had against a multi-million-dollar criminal. Conspiracy. To understand why my house is currently a crime scene wrapped in yellow tape, you have to understand the land it sat on. A 2-acre slice of paradise that my grandfather bought back in the 40s when this whole area was just cornfields and dust, a property that was grandfathered in long before the developers came with their bulldozers and cookie-cutter blueprints to build Oak Haven Estates. A sprawling subdivision of beige stucco and manicured lawns that surrounded our little farmhouse like an invading army. We were the holdouts, the sore thumb in a sea of uniformity, with our wraparound porch, my woodworking shop where I restored antique chairs, and yes, a small coop of heritage chickens that provided fresh eggs and a sense of connection to the earth that you just can't buy at a supermarket. And for years it was peaceful, just me and my wife Sarah, watching the sun come up over the herb garden while the kids ran around feeding the birds. A simple, quiet existence that we owned free and clear. And then Cynthia Sterling moved in. Imagine the human embodiment of a passive-aggressive sticky note, a woman with hair so heavily sprayed it could withstand a hurricane, and a white Mercedes that looked like it had never touched a paved road, a real estate agent with dollar signs in her eyes and a terrifying amount of free time, who had just been elected president of the Oak Haven Homeowners Association. She showed up on our porch 3 days after moving in, holding a basket of store-bought muffins and a smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes, welcoming us to the neighborhood despite the fact that we had lived here 30 years longer than she had, and sliding a thick packet of HOA bylaws across the table with the assumption that we would just sign our freedom away. When I politely explained that our deed predated the association by decades and that we had absolutely no legal obligation or desire to join her club, that plastic smile flickered, just for a second, revealing something sharp and ugly underneath, and she simply said, "Well, we all want to protect our property values, don't we, Arthur?" in a tone that sounded less like a question and more like a declaration of war. The escalation wasn't gradual, it was an avalanche, starting with a certified letter regarding community aesthetic violations and rapidly spiraling into a daily barrage of anonymous complaints filed with the city, citing us for everything from tall grass to illegal livestock, which was hilarious because I would go to work, walk to the filing cabinet, pull out the complaints Cynthia had filed against me, and then deny them myself because I knew the code better than anyone. But Cynthia was relentless, a force of nature fueled by entitlement, and when the official channels didn't work, she switched tactics to a campaign of psychological warfare that was honestly impressive in its cruelty, organizing wellness walks, where she and her minions would stroll past our fence, 5 or 6 of them in matching tracksuits, holding their phones up to film my children playing in the yard like they were exhibits in a zoo, whispering loudly about property values and sanitation risks. I tried to ignore it. I really did, for Sarah's sake. But then I found the paperwork that changed everything. A series of complaint forms Cynthia had submitted to the county where she explicitly checked the box for commercial farming operation instead of residential, a deliberate lie designed to trigger stricter zoning audits and fines, which is actually a Class B misdemeanor in our state. That was the moment I stopped being a neighbor and started being an investigator, pulling my dusty binders of municipal ordinances off the shelf and highlighting Section 14C regarding grandfathered agricultural use, realizing that while she was playing checkers with petty harassment, I was about to play 4D chess with the law. I filed a formal counter-complaint for filing false instruments, documenting every single lie she had put on government documents. And when the city inspector, a rookie named Kevin who looked like he was 12 years old, came out to investigate her claims, I walked him through my property with the confidence of a man who knows he is untouchable, showing him the original 1965 survey maps and the zoning variances I had memorized, watching his head nod in agreement as we dismissed every single one of Cynthia's allegations. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought the shame of being publicly rebuked by the city would send her back to her McMansion to lick her wounds, but I underestimated the depths of her greed, because this wasn't just about chickens or unpainted fences. This was about something much darker. I started doing a little digging into Cynthia's past, using the databases I had access to at work, and what I found made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She wasn't just a busybody. She was a serial arsonist of dreams, holding real estate licenses in 3 different states where she had left a trail of accidental fires, mysterious floods, and condemned properties, all of which were eventually bought up for pennies on the dollar by a shell company called Sterling Horizons LLC. She was a professional predator who targeted holdout homeowners, made their lives a living hell, and then swooped in to buy the charred remains of their defiance. And she had clearly decided that my 2 acres were her next payday. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted from annoying to genuinely threatening. With strange cars idling at the end of our driveway at 3 in the morning, their headlights cutting through the darkness like eyes watching us, and my daughter Maya coming home from school in tears because none of the other kids were allowed to sit with her at lunch anymore, their parents having been told by Cynthia that our chickens carried some rare, airborne disease. A lie so absurd it would be funny if it wasn't isolating my children in their own hometown. I installed security cameras, high-definition eyes watching every corner of my land. And that's when we caught the first act of true violence, a grainy video of a hooded figure climbing over our back fence in the dead of night, not to steal, but to destroy, pouring antifreeze into the water troughs of our chicken coop. Finding those birds the next morning, animals my children had named and hand-fed since they were chicks, lying stiff and cold in the dirt, broke something inside me, replacing my patience with a cold, hard rage that I hadn't felt in years. And as I buried them under the old oak tree while Sarah held the sobbing kids, I looked directly into the lens of my own security camera, knowing Cynthia would be watching the fallout. And I vowed that I wasn't just going to beat her, I was going to dismantle her entire life, brick by legal brick. The war had officially moved from paperwork to violence, and the silence in our house was deafening, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that comes when you realize your sanctuary has been breached. And as I sat at my dining room table covered in maps, deeds, and bank records, looking less like a father and more like a detective hunting a serial killer, I knew I couldn't do this alone. I made 3 phone calls that night, assembling a team that was essentially the Avengers of municipal retribution. Mike, my college roommate who was now an investigative journalist with a nose for corruption and a grudge against bullies. Jessica, a shark of a property rights attorney who specialized in tearing down overreaching HOAs. And DAV. ID, a forensic accountant who could track a single dollar bill through a hurricane. We turned my workshop into a war room, pinning timelines to the wall with red string connecting Cynthia Sterling to Sterling Horizons LLC and a web of investors stretching all the way back to California. But the real smoking gun, the piece of evidence that made Jessica gasp, was a hidden clause in the Oak Haven HOA charter, a clause signed off by City Councilwoman Eleanor Riggs. Riggs was the head of the zoning committee, a woman I had trusted, but the documents showed she was a silent partner in Cynthia's shell company, receiving kickbacks for every blighted property that the city condemned and forced into sale, a revelation that meant the rot didn't just stop at the neighbor's fence, it went all the way to City Hall. They were using the machinery of the government, my government, the system I had served for 25 years, to steal land from citizens, forcing them out with harassment, and then using eminent domain laws to seize the deeds for community redevelopment, turning a massive profit on the misery of families like mine. "They're not trying to get you to join the club, Arthur," David said, his face pale in the glow of his laptop screen. "They're trying to liquidate you." The escalation hit its peak on a Tuesday when Cynthia played her trump card, staging a burglary at her own home, smashing her own windows and filing a police report claiming that violent anti-HOA agitators had stolen sensitive files, a performance worthy of an Academy Award that allowed her to file a massive insurance claim and paint me as a dangerous radical to the rest of the neighborhood. But she got sloppy, listing items as stolen that we had footage of her moving into her trunk 2 hours before the break-in. And while she was busy playing the victim at an emergency town hall meeting, whipping the terrified residents of Oak Haven into a frenzy about the threat in their midst, we were watching the real threat unfold on my monitors. It was 2 a.m. on a Friday when the endgame began, and the air was thick with the smell of impending disaster, because David had found a new insurance policy taken out on my property, not by me, but by the HOA, under a community liability loophole that Councilwoman Riggs had slipped into the bylaws weeks ago, a policy that paid out double in the event of a total loss by fire. They're going to burn it. I whispered into the phone to Mike, who was parked 3 streets over in a dark van, recording everything. Tonight's the night. I had evacuated Sarah and the kids to her mother's house under the guise of a weekend trip, leaving the house dark and empty, a tempting target for a woman who thought she was untouchable, while I crouched in the absolute darkness of the hayloft in my old barn, shivering not from the cold, but from the adrenaline pumping through my veins like ice water. A rental truck with its lights off rolled silently down the street, stopping just outside my perimeter, and 2 men dressed in black tactical gear, not teenagers, not pranksters, but professionals, slipped through the gate carrying red jerry cans that sloshed with the heavy, distinct sound of gasoline. I watched through the viewfinder of a high-powered night vision camera as they moved with military precision, splashing accelerant along the foundation of my home, soaking the porch where I drank my coffee, dousing the walls of the workshop where I built my life, and finally, rigging a delayed ignition device near the gas meter, a setup designed to look like a tragic utility failure that would blow the house off the map once the morning furnaces kicked on. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run down there, to tackle them, to scream, to save the physical structure of my home, but I knew that if I stopped them now, they would just come back next week, and Cynthia would stay free to terrorize someone else. I had to let them finish the setup to prove the intent, to capture the conspiracy on film. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as they set the timer and slipped away into the night, vanishing as quickly as they had arrived, leaving my home sitting on a literal powder keg. And the second their truck turned the corner, I was on the radio to the fire marshal, a man I'd known for 20 years who was waiting 2 blocks away with a silent alarm crew. They swooped in, neutralized the device, and preserved the scene, taking samples of the fuel, photographing the footprints, and dusting the timer for prints, turning my potential tragedy into an ironclad crime scene before the sun even crested the horizon. We had them. We had the arsonists on video. We had the financial trail leading to Cynthia. We had the corrupt politician, and we had the insurance fraud, but I wasn't satisfied with just an arrest. I wanted a spectacle. I wanted the world to see what happens when you push a man who knows the rules too far. The following morning, Cynthia Sterling stood at the podium of the community center, dressed in a pristine white suit that cost more than my car, addressing a crowd of frightened neighbors about the need for decisive action against the blight on their community, completely unaware that her hired goons were currently singing like canaries in a police interrogation room downtown, trading their silence for a plea deal that pointed the finger directly at her. I walked into that meeting, not as a victim, but as the grim reaper of municipal code, flanked by Jessica and 2 federal agents in windbreakers, the doors swinging open with a dramatic thud that silenced the room instantly. "Good morning, Cynthia," I said, my voice calm but carrying to the back of the room without a microphone. "I believe you have something that belongs to me, my property rights, and about $3 million in fraudulent insurance claims." The color drained from her face so fast it looked like her soul had left her body, and before she could stammer out one of her rehearsed lies, the agents were moving in, handcuffs gleaming under the fluorescent lights, reciting her rights in a monotone that sounded like the most beautiful music I had ever heard. "Cynthia Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, wire fraud, RICO violations, and attempted murder," the lead agent announced, snapping the cuffs on her wrists as the entire room gasped, neighbors pulling out their phones to live stream the downfall of their queen bee. She tried to run, a pathetic, stumbling lunge toward the side exit. But there was nowhere to go, her high heels slipping on the polished floor as the reality of her life crashed down around her. And at the same time, across town, police were kicking down the door of Councilwoman Riggs' office, seizing computers and files that would eventually expose a corruption ring spanning 5 states. The trial was a media circus, a national sensation that we dubbed the HOA hustle, with Mike's Expose winning a Pulitzer as he detailed how Sterling Horizons LLC had burned and bullied their way through neighborhoods across the Southwest. But the sweetest moment wasn't the headlines, it was the sentencing. I stood in the courtroom, Sarah squeezing my hand so hard her knuckles were white, as Judge Harrigan looked down at Cynthia, now wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with her complexion, and delivered a lecture that should be etched in stone. "You used the concept of community as a weapon," he said, his voice thundering. "You took the sanctity of the home and turned it into a commodity to be stolen." She got 20 years, federal time, no parole, and Riggs got 15, effectively ending her political career and sending a shockwave through every corrupt municipal board in the country. We rebuilt the house, of course. It took a year, but we built it better, bigger, with a new workshop and a reinforced coop for a new flock of chickens, named Justice, Liberty, and Hope. And the community of Oak Haven changed too, dissolving the HOA and replacing it with a voluntary neighborhood watch that actually looked out for each other instead of measuring grass height with a ruler. But as I sit here now on my new porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon and listening to the happy clucking of the birds, I can't help but think about the cost of it all, the fear in my children's eyes, the nights spent watching monitors, the absolute violation of having to prove that you have a right to exist in your own home. It feels good, sure, the victory is sweet, but it leaves you with a question that keeps me up at night. At what point does enforcing the rules become a tool for tyranny? We trust these associations, these councils, these little governments to protect us, to keep things orderly. But who watches the watchmen when they decide that your way of life doesn't fit their aesthetic? I was lucky. I had the badge, the knowledge, friends, and the stubbornness to fight back. But what about the people who don't? What about the grandmother who just signs the paper because she's scared, or the family that moves away because they can't handle the pressure? That's the real tragedy here, not the burned wood or the legal fees, but the silence of the victims who didn't know how to fight back. So, I'm asking you, where's the line? Do you think HOAs protect our neighborhoods? Or are they just incubators for power-tripping tyrants like Cynthia? Have you ever had a neighbor who tried to legislate your life away? Let me know in the comments, because if there is one thing I've learned from the fires of Oak Haven, it's that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good neighbors to stay silent. I'm Arthur Vance, and this was my Neighborhood War.